Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Imagine a child being born, not in chain, not in a prison, but in the arms of his mother. And yet in that very moment, before he even has a name, the law has already decided that he is not free. The law says he is not a human being. He is property. He can be sold, he can be inherited, he can be taken away from his mother. But where did this nightmare begin? To understand this darkness, we have to go back to the 17th century, to a small colony called Virginia, and to a year history has never forgotten, 1619. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back into my quiet world. In the previous episodes, we crossed the storms of the ocean together. We saw how Kofi was torn away from the warm heart of Africa, how the body of a human being was thrown into the belly of a ship like cargo, and how he was carried to the shores of Brazil, where before anyone even asked his name, they calculated the price of his body. But ladies and gentlemen, the bitter truth is this: Kofi's story was never just the story of one man. Kofi is the name of millions of human beings who were ripped away from their own land. Some were taken to Brazil, some to the islands of the Caribbean, and some to the English colonies of North America. So today, we are not leaving Kofi behind. We are following the trail of that same chain. The same chain that began in Africa, bled in Brazil, and in North America, slowly became law. Ladies and gentlemen, true horror does not always begin with the crack of a whip. Sometimes horror arrives with ink and paper. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is not the gun held over your head, but the law that writes that you, your child, and your child's child are no longer human beings, but property. Today, I want to take you to the middle years of the 17th century, to the land that would later be called America, a land that at that time was not yet one country, but a scattering of fragile colonies. And yet those small colonies were growing on the blood of black people. We have to understand how a human being was turned on paper into property, how slavery changed from something uncertain and temporary into something inherited, permanent, and legal. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1619, the first recorded group of kidnapped Africans arrived in Virginia. They first came ashore at Point Comfort, and afterward, some of them were taken and sold in Jamestown. A few days later, another ship brought more Africans. To the men standing on that shore, it may have looked like nothing more than a transaction. But history knows that scene marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in America. In those early years, the law was not yet fully settled. Some Africans worked beside poor white indentured servants. On the surface, the system had not yet built the thick racial wall that would come later. There was still the possibility that some of these people, after some years, might gain their freedom. But greed makes its decision far sooner than justice does. Tobacco was bringing enormous wealth to English settlers and landowners. Virginia's fields were hungry for labor, and the plantation owners needed hands that would do the work, stay silent, and never demand freedom. So little by little, the law began to change. In 1640, something happened that left a deep crack in the bones of justice. A black man named John Punch ran away with two white servants. All three were captured. All three were brought before the court. But when the sentence came down, justice suddenly revealed two different faces. The two white men were sentenced only to a few more years of service, but John Punch was condemned to remain in bondage for life. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not just a ruling. This was one of the first moments when the Virginia court, in practice, declared that a different law would be written for dark skin. But the question that sends a chill through every human soul begins here. If an enslaved woman gives birth to a child, what becomes of that baby? Is the child free? Or from the very moment of birth, before he has even opened his eyes, does he already belong to someone else? The answer to that question created one of the darkest laws in history. In December of 1662, Virginia passed a law saying that all children born in that colony would be free or enslaved according to the condition of their mother. That meant if the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved too. The law deliberately cast aside the common English rule that usually traced a child's condition through the father. And with that one sentence, the womb of the black woman became part of the machinery that produced slaves. Ladies and gentlemen, think about the depth of that horror. From that moment on, the master no longer imagined himself the owner of only today's labor. In his mind, he was now the owner of generations yet to come. No longer was it necessary for ships from Africa to arrive every single time. It was enough for a woman on a plantation to become pregnant, and the law would do the rest. In such a world, motherhood for an enslaved woman was not only joy and hope, it was fear that stole sleep from her eyes at night. Every movement of the child in her womb could feel less like the promise of life and more like the sound of another chain being forged. Women looked at their swelling bellies and knew that the law had already passed judgment on that child. But why did Virginia's lawmakers do such a thing? What kind of mind sat behind those wooden desks, cold enough to reduce the fate of millions of human beings to a single line? And more bitter still, why did religion and the church, which spoke so often about saving souls, remain silent before such legal corruption? Ladies and gentlemen, this is where we step into the dark hallways of the law, a place where words became sharper than the whip itself. Before this, there had still been narrow openings, however small. One of the most important of those openings was the case of a woman named Elizabeth Key. Elizabeth was the daughter of an African woman and a white father. She had been baptized, and her father was free. When she went to court to fight for her freedom, she used the language of the law itself against the people who owned it. And in 1656, she won her freedom. That victory terrified the slaveholders. They understood that if there was a path to freedom through the law, then many others might also find their way through it. So they decided to seal every crack. That is why the law of 1662 was not just a simple law. It was a calculated reaction. They wanted to make sure that no child could ever again slip through the gears of the system by claiming a free father. They wanted slavery to pass from mother to child, without the need for new papers, without argument, without a trial. Ladies and gentlemen, from that moment on, the black family in American law was almost meaningless. The marriages of enslaved people had no real legal standing. A master could sell the father, keep the mother, and send the child to another plantation. The family was broken apart not by love, but by the will of the market. But one great question still remained: religion. Many enslaved people believed that if they were baptized and became Christian, perhaps they could no longer be held as slaves. Perhaps in the eyes of God and in the Christian world, they would be recognized as spiritual brothers and sisters of white Christians. But in 1667, Virginia lawmakers closed that path as well. They declared that baptism did not change a person's condition as a slave. In other words, even heaven alone could not unlock the chains of earth. Ladies and gentlemen, in a way, they were trying to give orders to God Himself. You do not have the right to disturb the order of tobacco, profit, and plantation wealth. Our Kofi may have been in Brazil, but the suffering he knew was the same suffering here. The sound of prayer rising from the church, while chains still remained fastened to hands and feet. Inside this legal suffocation, something else was beginning to grow. Something no court ruling could silence: buried anger. In 1680, Virginia passed yet another law, a law that forbade enslaved people from carrying weapons, from gathering in ways their masters considered threatening, and from leaving their master's land without permission. Any enslaved person found outside the boundaries of the plantation without written proof could be whipped. This law was not only about controlling the body, it was about controlling movement, voice, and even the possibility of coming together. But ladies and gentlemen, the higher the prison wall grows, the stronger the desire to fly becomes. And at that very same time, Virginia's wealthy class faced another fear, the fear of poor people uniting. For a time, poor white servants and Africans held under force did not live in completely separate worlds. They worked side by side. They breathed under the pressure of the same brutal system. And sometimes, most dangerous of all, they could begin to see that their real enemy was not each other's skin color, but the master who stood over both of them. Then came the year 1676, Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion, a revolt that was not just a political crisis. To the ruling class, it was a nightmare, because around it they saw the image of lower classes coming together, and that image filled those in power with fear. After the rebellion was crushed, the strategy of the slave-holding class became clearer. They understood that to preserve the plantation system, the whip alone would not be enough. A wall had to be built between the poor white man and the enslaved black man, not of stone, but of privilege, humiliation, and race. They said to the poor white man, "You may own no land, you may have no wealth, you may barely have bread to eat, but at least you are not black." Ladies and gentlemen, this became one of the foundations of what we now call structural racism. Little by little, the law turned whiteness into a legal and social privilege, and at the same time, blackness was tied more and more tightly to bondage, surveillance, and the stripping away of rights. Our narrative Kofi, whether in Brazil or in the American picture before us, was no longer facing only the master. He was facing an entire world that was closing in on him from every direction. Yesterday's companion could become today's overseer. Shared poverty gave way to a distance that the law itself had built. This process reached a new height at the beginning of the 18th century. In 1705, Virginia gathered together and reinforced a whole body of laws that made the slave system firmer and more official. Under these laws, people brought from non-Christian lands were formally fixed in the status of slavery, and their sale and purchase were further secured. The enslaved person was increasingly treated as property that could be bought, sold, inherited, and seized, not as a human being with natural rights, but as something to be weighed on the scale of profit. Ladies and gentlemen, look at the depth of this moral collapse. If the master died, the slave could be transferred along with the rest of his estate. If debts had to be paid, the body of a human being could become part of the accounting. The law did not see the soul. It understood only the price. And worse still, these laws did not merely define the relationship between slave and master. They drew the whole society into the machinery of control. The church, the court, the patrolman, the overseer, the neighbor, each of them could become a part of that machine. The prison was not just the plantation fence. The prison was the whole society. At the same time, religion became another battlefield. Masters were afraid that if enslaved people understood they were equal before God, they would no longer remain obedient. So they tried to turn religion itself into an instrument of submission. They repeated selected verses. They taught the enslaved to see obedience as worship. But under that pressure, the enslaved created their own reading of faith. In hidden gatherings in forests and thickets, they listened to the story of Moses and Exodus, the story of a people delivered from Pharaoh's bondage. And there, the very same text the master used to quiet the slave could become, in the heart of the slave, a promise of liberation. For some of them, faith was no longer only surrender. It became the language of hope. Ladies and gentlemen, by the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th, the point of no return had been crossed. What had once looked to planters like a solution to a labor shortage had now become a complete institution, a giant machine lubricated with human blood and driven by the insatiable greed of the global market. In this world, an old man like Kofi, whether as a narrative figure or as a symbol of millions of kidnapped Africans, if he looked at his grandchild, he would know that the law had already decided that child's fate. The child had not yet learned to walk, but the law had already written him down as property. He had not yet learned to speak, but the world had already prepared chains for him. This is where we understand that law does not enslave only the body. It paralyzes the conscience. The master slept peacefully at night because the paper told him what he was doing was legal. In the morning, he went to church because religion too had been interpreted in a way that would not threaten his plantation. And in this way, dehumanization took on the shape of virtue. But the legacy of these laws did not settle only upon black bodies. It poisoned white minds as well. The idea of race was planted so deeply into the fabric of society that its effects lasted for centuries. The imaginary wall they built between the poor white laborer and the enslaved black person did not stay on the plantation. It spread into neighborhoods, schools, churches, and the social structures that followed. And yet, even with all of that, slavery never became a right. It became legal, yes. It became an institution, yes. But it never became right. Because in the heart of that darkness, something always remained alive. Culture, song, prayer, memory, and that unquenchable human longing for freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, What began in 1619 was not simply the arrival of a few Africans in Virginia. It was the beginning of a system built to prove that some human beings were not born for freedom. But history does not always end the way lawmakers intend it to, because wherever chains are forged, somewhere else, the will to break them is born. And in the episodes ahead, we will see how those same black laws, those same chains, and those same carefully designed humiliations lit the fire of resistance. How men and women whom the law called things defied the system simply by remaining human. How faith, music, escape, and rebellion slowly began to crack the walls of this prison. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for walking with me again through this heavy and painful journey. Until next time, remember this truth. No law, no matter how cold or powerful, can bury human dignity forever.